Okay. So as Elizabeth said, we want to talk about the power of achievement stories for effective coaching. And one little caveat here, a couple caveats. We use achievement stories in a formal way as part of the MCOR review session, or is often used in that context. MCOR is an assessment that I helped co-develop, which stands for Motivational Core. And it's very, very useful in effectively reviewing that assessment with people. But I don't want to so much talk about the use of the interview in an assessment-focused way today, because there's broad application that can be, of course, used for helping people understand their own core motivations. Also, it can be highly effective in helping people understand their top strengths with the StrengthsFinder assessment. And there are also other assessments too, where there are insights about consistent, enduring dimensions of a person's pattern of giftedness. And the achievement story can also illustrate insights from those assessments also. But what I want to talk about today is this very, very fundamental and beautiful and actually quite simple approach of drawing out achievement stories. And I've got my first chat here, which is great. So let me pause. Yep. So this is being recorded, Ashley. And if you need to hop off or anybody else needs to hop off, that's understandable, but it will be recorded. So again, we want to just talk about achievement story interviewing as a basic tool, and you can apply it in a whole bunch of different contexts. And one other piece of caveat, and that is that I want to give you technique that you can use, but also at the end, I'd like to talk about how you can even employ a basic approach of cultivating achievement storytelling among cohorts that you might be teaching, students that you might have, people in a prayer group, folks on a retreat, or really any context where you are cultivating greater self-awareness and helping people to become more of who God made them to be. So you can deploy in a simple way the achievement storytelling exercise, and I just continually find it quite useful for getting people grounded in more of who they are. All right, so the power of achievement stories for effective coaching. Now because I've already been introduced, I'm just going to whip through this. Got our opening prayer done as well. Our session agenda here is as follows. I want to define achievement story. We want to look at the achievement story interview itself. I want to give basic steps for conducting the interview and then demonstrate it with Elizabeth. And then I want to speak with you about the many ways that this achievement story interview process can be powerful and fruitful. So these 5 basic agenda points. Now, we often will ask people to share their story. Now, this is a cross-cultural reality from the beginning of time. We get to know one another by sharing stories. So that's nothing new, that's nothing innovative, that's nothing special really. But we share all kinds of different stories about ourselves. And when we're asked to share about ourselves, we don't typically talk about our achievement stories. We might talk about our family of origin. We might talk about the college that we come from, our alma mater. We might talk about the region that we're a part of, right? If we're from Texas, we may take great pride in that and declare our interest in the Dallas Cowboys and that kind of thing. We may talk about other clubs or groups that we are a part of. So there's a lot of different ways to share ourselves with stories. The achievement story is a particularly powerful way of revealing oneself. And it's a description of something a person did that they believe they did well, as they define well, something a person enjoyed doing, or ultimately provided a deep sense of satisfaction. So that's basically it. Achievement story is a description of those activities. And when we draw people into a conversation where they get at the details of that achievement story, it's quite powerful. So I want to talk with you a little bit about the right kinds of stories. So I want to get a little bit more granular in terms of what we mean by good achievement story, assuming that you as coaches and facilitators will be asking clients to identify their stories. So I want to give you some help in facilitating the right kinds of stories. So I want to dwell here a little bit and not just take it for granted that this simple description is going to be sufficient, although it is, I think, a full definition. So it's really important that when we're drawing out achievement stories from our clients, that they not be passive experiences, but they need to be activities with key details about what people actually did. So for example, somebody might rightly say, yeah, I had a great experience on my high school basketball team. It's true. But what we're looking for in achievement stories are, again, more specific activities with important details. So, for example, a person might say, well, I was named player of the week for my high school basketball team, and I scored 25 points in a game against our biggest rival. And so what we want to do is get people as much as possible into those, again, concrete details. And not passive experiences. So if a person talks about going to the Italian Alps and having great food and enjoying the beautiful scenery, that's perhaps a wonderful experience, but not an achievement story activity. Some other contrasts. Achievement stories are not labels that characterize a person, even though that may be an important part of who they are. So if somebody says, yeah, I'm a sorority member, or I'm a part of the Knights of Columbus, I'm on my parish's leadership team, that doesn't get at, again, activity. So a contrasting example would be this. As membership director for Pi Beta Phi, I increased freshman pledge class by 150%, right? So again, activities that orient a person in action. That's what we're after. Also, there are some achievement activities which take place over time, but again, as much as possible, they're not general, but they're specific activities that can be supported with vivid examples. So somebody could rightly say, yeah, I'm good at studying, or I'm good at leading, or I'm good at gardening. We want particular details as follows. Now, does this all make sense to those that are gathered here? Is this clear enough? Okay. Sue's asking here, will we be getting a copy of the PowerPoint? And I would be delighted to share with you a copy of the PowerPoint. And I'd even be happy to share with you a simple worksheet that you can look to facilitate an achievement story exercise with others or go through the process yourself. So I'd be happy to share that also. 2 or 3 page sheet that you can draw upon. All right, so hopefully these are some ways to help you understand at a more detailed level what we mean by achievement story and how to help others identify it. Now, these activities can be from various spheres of activity in life or from any time. Right, so school, church, sports, professional activities, volunteer activities at home, leisure time, wherever and whenever. And from a coaching perspective, it's often quite interesting when our clients choose achievement activities from certain periods of life or spheres of activity. Right, so for example, if you're working with a 55-year-old executive and he or she only shares achievement stories from high school, now that's interesting from a coaching perspective, right? Or if they talk nothing about family activities at all, even though they're married with a bunch of kids, that might be interesting. Of course, I'm not claiming here that there's some definitive understanding that we get, but you can probe more into reasons for why people draw achievement stories from certain activity or certain spheres of life or times of life. All right, so when we're clear about what an achievement story is, now let's step into the interview process. So my grandfather, in working with Bernard Haldane years ago, who was one of the first career counselors, developed a pretty specific approach towards drawing out achievement stories. And there are other similar approaches. Appreciative inquiry is one similar approach to helping people talk about what's going well, what they're doing well. So my claim here is not that the achievement story interview is an innovative, completely innovative approach developed by my grandfather in the system for identifying motivated abilities, but my own understanding of achievement story interviewing comes from that history. So system for identifying motivated abilities was a process that my grandfather developed, and his organization over many, many years more keenly sharpened up this behavioral interviewing technique. And the basic purpose is to get a verbal picture of a client in action, doing what he or she has enjoyed doing and believes he or she has done well. So that's what the achievement story is really all about. When we can get a snapshot or a moving picture of a person in action, again, doing what they've loved to do, that's what we're all about. And if you can focus upon that as the basic objective and keep to that focus, you'll do well. You'll do well. So there is an analytical purpose. And for many, many years, when I was doing SEMA biography work, motivational patterning, I approached the interview process really more from this kind of scientific analytical approach. Getting data, understanding what's going on with the person so that I could analyze the narrative and see the patterns of giftedness that are present there. And when I was trained, one of the persons who trained me said that you can think about the achievement story interview as getting core samples from different parts of a person's life. And it is that. It can be used in that way. So revealing patterns of giftedness. And again, this includes different dimensions of the person revealed by different assessments. So MCORE is a process, very rich process, assessment of getting at core motivations. And we use stories in MCORE. So the stories express those core motivations, but it's a saturated phenomena, the achievement story. And there's a lot more there besides core motivations, although those are at the heart of the stories. A person's natural strengths are also revealed in achievement stories, the way that they naturally are wired to relate to others. Although, of course, through virtue, through training, we can improve how we relate. But there is a kind of natural way of functioning with other people that the stories reveal. So there's a lot there in the achievement stories. And if you're trying to precisely identify those patterns, you can use the achievement story interview for that approach. But it's also quite useful simply for building relationship. And in fact, more and more, and I plan on writing about this, and I've been doing workshops to this effect, it can be a profound exercise and experience in relationship. So my experience has been that most people are not asked to share their achievement stories at any level of depth. And most people don't encounter an empathic listener as they're sharing their story. So when you as a coach really attend with care and love and empathy to a person sharing some of the most beautiful golden parts of their life, when you attend to that, receive it with empathy, and then reflect back what you're hearing. That's absolutely powerful. And in one sense, more important than the analytical process, because you're affirming the person in that moment at a great level of depth. So the experience that you provide as a coach, as a facilitator, of walking a person through their achievement story is golden. There'll often be tears of joy shed. People will remember things that they'd forgotten for years because they'd not been asked to share these stories. They will also make neurological connections with other parts of their life that they've forgotten for years. So it's not uncommon for people to say, I haven't thought about that for years. Also, what happens is that the same kind of joy that they experienced in enacting those stories when they first were enacted, those are represented as the person shares their stories. You know, not in an exacting way, but I'm absolutely convinced that there's an endorphin experience as they're sharing those stories. So there's a relational piece here that's quite powerful. A couple weeks ago, I was in New Jersey doing workshops for the Diocese of Camden, and had about 45 people in a room, and the purpose of the whole workshop was simply to help them learn how to do achievement story interviewing. Broke them up into pairs and taught them this process that they could take back to their parishes and leadership teams. So I wasn't talking about MCOR training or any assessment at that moment, but just the simple power of encountering another person around their stories. And I had a lady say, and I'm quoting her directly, she said, look, I've been going to daily mass with this lady over here for 10 years. And I've learned more about her in 10 minutes than I have in the last 10 years through this achievement story process. So the relational piece is very important. Now, we often, because we are highly relational, let's say, very extroverted, we often bring into the achievement story interview process a lot of the things that we do naturally and to good effect into that process. But it's important that we pay attention to certain parameters for a good achievement story interview. So it's not a venue for back and forth sharing. And that's very typical and very rich and very good as we're just getting to know somebody, right? A person might share a story and we might naturally say, oh yeah, I did the same thing, or I've had the same experience. And I do encourage you as a coach to be disciplined. If you're focused on drawing out an achievement story, don't make it be that. That preserve the beautiful moment of just listening with empathy. So I want to be a bit formal here, set up some rubrics here, because I want you to experience the power of this in the fullest sense. So it's not a time for back and forth sharing. It's also not a place to discuss psychological reasons for why clients acted as they did. So if you're in the rhythm of drawing out detail, getting a picture of a client in action, you don't want to interrupt that by saying, well, was it how you were raised that you were doing that? Or because you were trained in the Marine Corps? Or because you're an American? Because what that happens is it interrupts what can be the beautiful experience of representing that moment of action. So you don't want to interrupt that. You want to get into it. You want to have them be in the flow of it. And you want them as much as possible to represent that flow. And when they're in the flow of activity, they're not thinking about psychological reasons for why they were doing what they're doing, right? They're just acting. And when we see people in the pure action of their unique essence, that's beautiful. So it's also not a context for testing out your assumptions about like what their core motivations are, or what their strengths are, or starting to analyze at that very moment. So if you're disciplined in just getting a picture of the client in action and listen well and ask the kinds of questions which draw them out, you're going to get good results. Right. So helping clients get started. Now, from an MCOR context, or if I'm doing a full motivational pattern, I have a whole prep form that I have people fill out. So with MCOR in particular, it's possible to send the person the link to take the assessment without the prep form. As an MCOR coach, however, I always send out a prep form that lists examples of good achievement stories, and helps them recognize what we shared earlier, that it's got to be active and detail-oriented and concrete. And that's useful to have a prep form. And typically in my own coaching, before I even have my clients take the MCOR assessment, I will give them the prep form, they'll complete it, and then I'll actually interview them about that. So I'll interview them on the basis of the prep form. But if I'm doing a workshop for 40, 50 people, I don't have them do a prep form. And you can do this yourselves, where you simply say, all right, guys, get a blank piece of paper, get a pen, sit back, and think of a time in life where you have deeply enjoyed some activity, you thought you did it pretty well, and you found it ultimately satisfying. And just take a minute. Could be from any time of life, could be back in high school, could be from any sphere of activity. Just kick back and listen, and listen to yourself. And I've always had people come up with one or two stories. It's also important in that you share with them. It doesn't have to be successful according to contemporary standards. It doesn't have to be dramatic or impressive. In fact, I was just doing a pattern this morning on a guy who loves mowing lawns. And his very first achievement was mowing his dad's lawn. And even today, he says, oh, I get back to the farm for some seat time on the tractor. And I love it, right? So simple. So if you're in a situation where you just try to get people to interact around achievement stories, you don't have to have a long prep form, but they can very quickly identify some achievement stories. So different ways to get clients started with achievement stories. If you're doing a deep dive, it is important, I think, to have clients take some time with a prep form, but it's not necessary for you as a coach to have a very powerful experience and to cultivate a powerful experience with achievement story interviewing. All right, now, basic steps here. And again, this is more of a formal process. You're not going to be able to train people exactly in this when you're doing this in a workshop context. And it's really important that we not trip over technique so much as concentrate again on getting a picture of the person in action. But if you do follow these steps, it's quite effective. So first step, note the achievement story summary. Just note it, or if you're again in a workshop context and you're just doing this fairly spontaneously, you just say, hey, what's your story? And they'll give a summary. And then tell me more about what you actually did. Because sometimes people give overall context, which is good, but you want action. You want action. So then you get specific detail. And in a moment, I'm going to open up this third step at more of a granular level and give you some examples of how to get specific detail. But you want to get specific detail. Oftentimes people, because they're so used to being in the flow of their patterns of motivation, will think that these more detail-oriented questions are a bit odd. Like, how did you actually study? How did you actually lead? How did you actually mow the lawn? But it's important because those details reveal the precise and beautiful elements of their pattern. And then a question that you don't ever want to leave out, whether you're doing a 5-minute interview and then having people switch hats, and they're becoming a responder or storyteller as opposed to interviewer. You want to make sure that when they're asking these questions as interviewer, that they pose this question: what was most deeply satisfying to you about the achievement? All right, I get tired of hearing myself talk here. So any questions about these basic steps? Okay. So some ways to
Josh,
please.
I have a question. Can you pull up on the screen a copy of that, or your prep form, possibly?
The MCOR prep form?
Yeah.
Sure.
So we can take a look at that. I just think that would be helpful to have that on this.
Sure. I'll do it. Bear with me. All right, now as I'm doing this, I have a little exercise for you as I'm slowly pulling it up. Just take a minute. I would like you to get a piece of paper and write down the names of 3 people that you would like to take through an achievement story exercise. And I'm going to even press you a little bit, that you will take through an achievement story exercise in the next 2 weeks. So just think of people who could really that would be blessed, deeply blessed by you taking time with them to draw out their achievement stories. And maybe pray for a minute about who those people should be as I pull this up. All right, just about there. All right, so here's the prep form, and I'd be happy to send this to you guys as well. This is obviously specifically oriented towards taking the MCOR assessment with the broader process of the system for identifying motivated abilities. We have like a 20-page form. And I'm a sucker for the depth of it, but so here's what it is. Again, we define it as an achievement story, something a person enjoyed doing, but they believe they did well, they found deeply satisfying. It's imperative that we put down what was important to ourselves when we're doing achievement story recollection, not simply what other people thought was important. So here's some summary examples. I built and mastered the tallest pair of stilts in my neighborhood. That may be a little antiquated. I may need to change that. But you'll notice that these are, again, very specific and detail-oriented. And then we just have a spot for briefly capturing those. Not a lot of space here, because again, it's oriented towards taking the assessment. But I like more detail.
Yeah. So Josh, another follow-up question for this. So one of the reasons we decided to have this webinar was because you, Josh, went through the HFC Human Formation Coalition Strengths and APEST coach training. And, you know, we're talking about having you now train MCOR coaches on Strengths and APEST. And one of the points you made was that you feel that we could elevate, Human Formation Coalition could elevate how we train if we trained and equipped a little more intentionally around using achievement stories in StrengthsFinder coaching or APEST coaching.
Correct.
So now you were trained in January, this is April. So I know you've been coaching some people around strengths, and talk to us a little bit, because everybody on this call has been trained with strengths. I think Elizabeth's also been trained at MCOR, but talk about how that has been helpful to you, Josh, using the stories in your strengths coaching.
So I think it's important, generally speaking, and this is definitely the case with StrengthsFinder, that we not be assessment focused. So the way, and I'm putting my own StrengthsFinder cap on, and I'd like you to put your StrengthsFinder cap on. It is effective to go through those top 5 strengths and have people respond to what resonates, what connects, and what doesn't. But when you can begin with some achievement stories and then ground those StrengthsFinder results in the experience that you have collectively had with them, of them sharing their stories, and show them where the strengths are consistently emerging, then they recognize the strengths not merely as something that they tend to do, but as part of the very fabric of what gives them most delight. You're making the strengths very concrete. You're embedding them in their own experience at a deeper level. They also can see, and we're going to talk about this, Pat, a little bit more, but they can also see the integration of those strengths, their connection with one another in the context of story. And so that way it takes the strengths out of the realm of a basic description of who they are to being this part of the lifeblood of how they act in an integrated way. So it presents vivid illustration that kind of makes it pop, makes it more alive, makes it more robust, as opposed to, yeah, that's who I am. And so sometimes when we approach the StrengthsFinder review process that way, it can resonate, but it lacks lifeblood, I think. And what the narrative does is it provides some adrenaline, some lifeblood, and some vividness, and also connects it with deeply positive memories, which I think is very powerful from a coaching perspective, if you really want to ground them in an experience that they won't forget. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is. Elizabeth, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but my understanding is that you've been embedding more of the story narrative into your strengths coaching. Can you comment on what your experience has been, if you've done that?
Yeah, it's been life-giving to the time I've had coaching individuals. I think it just adds to the pure enjoyment of our time together, because they are reflecting more on something that gave them joy, and something that they found very fulfilling. As kind of as Josh had said, it takes them back and they're reliving that joy all over again and being able to share. It also helps me as I coach to hold on to those things that I know that they're really good at or really enjoying, and keep coming back to that and figuring out how to inject that into their ministry that they're doing now. So for me, it gives me something else to hold on to, and bring them back to over and over again in context of their strengths.
Well, one dovetail comment, Elizabeth, on that. I think that's excellent that it gives you as a coach that memory, something to hold on to, especially as you're coaching them in the context of their own work. And I'm sure you'll agree that it also gives them the ability to articulate their strengths in a vivid narrative-based way also. So that if we're doing this in a team context, to say I have woo or connectedness, or I'm a learner, if you're saying that to somebody who understands strengths and you're using the similar grammar, that's great. That says something. But if you can say, yeah, I'm a learner, and here's an example of me doing it, that was absolutely life-giving, then you're also embedding that, you're facilitating a deeper and richer and more holistic understanding of yourself to that person, and vice versa.
I have a question, Josh.
Yes, Sue.
So if you take a story back to childhood or teen years or early adulthood, are your strengths from StrengthsFinder, were those your strengths back then? Or do your strengths change over time?
I believe, and this is the position of Clifton and the founders of StrengthsFinder, as I understand it, and that is that our strengths can change, they can develop at some level, but there really are patterns of consistent natural talent. And the idea on StrengthsFinder is to identify those abiding natural talents that can then be developed into strengths. So I may be overstating that a bit based upon my own assumptions, but it's very clear to me that they believe there are innate talents and that they're trying to have people draw them out. You know, your top 10 may shift, certainly based upon experience and what you emphasize, but I know that those who develop StrengthsFinder are not looking upon strengths as something that are merely developed competencies, but innate. Yep. So Ashley's point here is that hers changed slightly from age 22 to age 34. And I think that's not uncommon, Ashley. But part of it could be this, that a natural talent is maybe worked on a bit more, or you've had experiences which maybe draw it out more. But the idea of kind of radically shifting, I have not experienced that.
I didn't have, all right, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hello.
Hey, sorry, like been off and on, but I didn't have radical shifts, but well, slightly, because, okay, so woo and empathy have always stayed in my top 2, or top 5, but I had developer and responsibility in my top 5, and those 2 dropped below my top 10 in that time. I think because I was depressed during that time when I was 22, and had a lot of my very heart, the way I was brought up was very heavy at that time. And then I kind of came into my own self by 34 when I took it again last year.
Okay.
So those core ones, woo and empathy, are very deep in me. And then several of my top 10 were the same. Yep. But those 2, the responsibility and developer, just like dropped.
Okay.
Out.
Now I want to comment on something you just said, and that is that when you took it later, you felt like you were coming more into your true self. And so what I hear you saying is that that's more authentic to who you are.
I think so.
And so I think it is the case that childhood experiences or trauma can certainly impact how strengths show up. But if I hear you correctly, what you're pointing to is that those were present. Your top strengths were present back then, but they weren't allowed to be unleashed, right? They weren't allowed to flourish. And so, I mean, it's absolutely the case that we can provide conditions for people for them to be more of who they're supposed to be.
Right.
And that's critical.
And also, I feel like what's so important, and maybe you hit on this and I didn't hear it, but helping them turn the dark sides of, because I had a dark side of my empathy, right? Because I remember I'd be 7, 8 years old, and I'd be walking down the street and see a homeless person and then just start crying and uncontrollably. You know, it was
right.
There was that, and then I would get stepped on all the time because I just felt everyone's pain. So I would, so I learned to balance that empathy.
Right.
Of
course.
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with you, but it's also interesting that you're the way you're talking about that empathy is as if it is an innate part of who you are. And I think that's very true, that our natural talents are with us. They can be cultivated. They can become more what they're supposed to be. We've got to manage them, absolutely. But when we're talking about natural talent, we're not talking about something that's just inserted by training. Right.
I do feel like, though, that one of my ones in my top 5 activator, I feel like that got inserted when I became a mom. Like, I just became, all right, let's get this done.
Right.
I don't know if I had that before.
Sure.
Maybe.
Well, the human experience is a mystery, and I don't want to be too dogmatic because obviously we enter into experiences that are a surprise and a shock, right?
Mm.
But just as our genetic code is stable, God's not going to give us a genetic code at a purely physical level, which is this beautiful pattern, and then give us a kind of blank slate at the soul level, right? That's not how anthropology works. The body is what it is at a very pattern level because we have a certain design of soul, right? The whole being is patterned and designed. And certain experiences draw aspects of us out more than others. All right, excellent. Well, let's go back to the PowerPoint here. And what I'd like to do is do a demonstration here in a bit after getting some more specific detail. So ways to get at detail. How did you go about, fill in the verb? How did you go about leading, gardening, wooing, including? Give me an example of that. If I was a fly on the wall, what would I see you doing? Right. So again, you want to emphasize getting a picture of the person in action. Please give me more detail about X, Y, or Z. So those are just some sample questions for getting more detail. Now what I'd like to do is demonstrate a bit here. Now this is a story from Elizabeth, our host, that she used for her MCOR assessment. So just take a minute to scan that over, read it over. And then what I want you to pay attention to is how I'm drawing out her story and the kinds of questions that I'm asking. I'm going to add one component that we haven't talked about too much up to this point. And that is, I'm going to add the component of also reflecting to Elizabeth some of the things that I'm hearing from her after she shares. And then we'll talk a bit about why that can be important as well. Okay, so Elizabeth, you with me?
Yes.
All right, great. I can't see you. There we go, there you are, okay. All right, so thanks for agreeing to do the demonstration here. Now, one more caveat here, and that is that sometimes you can spend 15 minutes on an achievement story, sometimes less time. And if you're in a situation where you're just trying to get a bit more detail, or you're facilitating some sharing in a team context or a workshop context, or you're like trying to get a bit more about a particular strength, if you're using the StrengthsFinder assessment, like you don't have to spend a whole bunch of time. These can be shorter or longer, is my basic point. All right, so Elizabeth, just share at a broad level here initially what you did to lead this 2016 summer service team to Central Asia. Some of the key things that you did.
Yeah, we started in November training, and I was in charge of 8 students. I was in charge of all aspects of the trip, and even coordinating with the people in the country, even though we weren't there quite yet. And so we left in May and were there for 6 weeks. So I took a lot of time to prepare them before we even left. We did monthly Google Hangout conversations, and then I prepared for everything we could imagine before we even got there. And I think I was super intentional of making them think it was going to be worse than it would be, so that they wouldn't be disappointed, or that they would think, oh, this is easy, when really all the things that they endured and went through weren't actually easy, but compared to what I told them it was going to be, it seemed okay. Prayer, scripture every day, as much as possible through preparing things before we got there so that we had them to use when we were there. We met daily with missionaries in country and, helped to create those relationships for them.
Mhm.
I did everything that they would need done, kind of like a mom would do, so that they could function as a team and be out there being the ones doing what needed to be done. And I stepped away from them a lot, letting them come together as a group, and me functioning so that to help them, but not with them as an actual team member.
Okay. So you started out your write-up here by saying preparing 8 college students, and then you used that language of preparing a couple times in what you just shared. So give us some detailed description or example of you in preparation mode.
So I made devotions for 8 weeks ahead of time. So every day, morning and night devotions, the packing list, which was like 6 pages long, because we were only allowed so much that we were able to bring. So we had to be really specific. Made prayer calendars for our churches and for the conference. Getting all the banking ready and the finances. I made them do Sherry Weidell's Called and Gifted. I made them do Myers-Briggs. This was before I knew anything about StrengthsFinders or anything else. And then we did Bible studies together before we even got there, and shared all kinds of stuff together in those Google Hangouts. I talked about everybody I could before I could even get there.
So you use the we pronoun in those Bible studies. Use the first person and share what you particularly did in those Bible studies. Like if we could see you in action doing Bible study, what would we notice from you?
Constantly trying to draw out from them what God is doing, because I think God prepares us each in a different way. And for a situation, because we're all going to be faced with it differently and have different reactions. So really trying to draw out those reactions that each one of them were having, so that I could understand their personality better, and they could understand each other more. And it's also creating a vulnerability before we even got in country to be together.
What do you mean by how you created vulnerability? How did you do that?
The more time I think that we spent together before we even got into country, we were able to see different sides of each other's personalities when we met, how we met, and the different topics, how we were going to deal with different things, and how we had dealt with them in the past. I also was able to be vulnerable myself to them so that they could see that, that I would allow them to see that side of myself.
What did you do especially well in leading the summer service team to Central Asia?
I was super intentional about making sure that they were glorifying God, or at least thinking about glorifying God in their actions and in their words, no matter who we were with. I constantly said it so that they realized they weren't representing themselves only, that they were representing God first, that they were representing the conference, that they were representing Americans, that they were representing Christians. And so all those things really needed to be in the forefront before they stepped forward into anything they did.
Okay. Let's pretend I was one of you, those 8 college students, and I'm experiencing you working to help me glorify God in all my actions, right? So you're helping me to do that. How would I experience you as you're helping me to really glorify Christ in my behavior?
We prayed before everything. That was really kind of my lead. I just really liked to pray, and we prayed at the end of everything too. So it was always reflecting, where can we go deeper? Where were my highs and lows of the day? So understanding what God is calling me to, understanding the scripture devotional every day. We walked through the Old Testament and the New Testament each day as a part of the process. So
what did you do to walk through the Old and New Testament?
We followed the lectionary, and I was with a group of Protestants, and I was the only Catholic. So they had never actually done that, gone through the lectionary, gone through stories specifically for a longer period of time. So that was a new experience for them. Yeah, for me, it was a lonely time because I really wanted to make sure that they bonded as a team. And so I watched them and I sat back, and I don't think they had, they didn't really have a clue on how intentional I was on them building relationships with each other and not necessarily me.
Okay. What was most deeply satisfying, Elizabeth, about what you did to lead this summer service trip?
At the end, when it was all said and done, we had to get up in front of over 1,000 people, and they had to reflect on their time there. And yeah, I really kept telling them, don't open your mouth unless you're going to glorify God. Make sure everything that you say glorifies God and that everybody else can understand it. This trip is not about you at all. It's about what God's doing. And you have years go by where people get up on stage, and they do this trip every year, and they tell stories that only they understand, and you can't follow them, and it's just really strange. And the leaders of the conference really heard a lot of comments afterwards. I don't know what you did with this group, but they glorified God by what they shared with everyone, and it was just amazing. And they didn't hear me use that language, and yet that was the language that I got in return. So I really felt like when all is said and done, I could walk away and feel proud that that God really used this team to show others what he's doing in the world.
So in a moment here, I'm going to have Pat comment here. Although I'm not going to let him steal my thunder, so I'll let you comment after I'm done. But just a couple points of reflection, and that is that there's such intentional preparation. So on the one hand, there's this organizational piece, Elizabeth, where you're preparing them very carefully. You've got packing lists. You've got the finances down. You're focused upon making sure that they are thinking it's going to be worse than it actually is, right? So you're highly focused upon preparation, but the preparation is ordered towards this focus upon their experience with Christ and giving him the glory. Their experience with Christ, with one another in their own relationships, and also giving Christ the glory. So a lot of intentional focus around our organization, but it's ordered towards this relational component of the relationship with our Lord, and then with one another. Yeah. So at a highlight, those are some things that I'm seeing. But let's talk about your top 5 strengths, and then Pat, I'd love for you to comment on what are your top 5, Elizabeth?
Relator, individualization, maximizer, responsibility, and deliberative.
Okay. All right. So those are clearly manifest here, but Pat, I'd like for you to share what you see.
Yeah, so it's funny. I've known Elizabeth for quite some time, and when she was going through the stories, I pulled up her top 5 in her APEST, and it's the epiphany for me is to see how this 10 or 15 minutes with your achievement stories just highlighted. So on APEST, your prophet teacher and your faithfulness to glorifying God in this Bible study, this teaching context, the responsibility and deliberative in terms of your preparation, your individualization and relator, and your ability and your desire to pour into these young people. I just want to make the comment that really, it's almost like in your context, I've never coached you, obviously, but the achievement story was like warp speed for me as a coach to peek into your top 5 into your APEST in 12 minutes. I could see all of those and how they connected to the point of why we're having this webinar and the importance of this in context of strengths coaching and APEST coaching.
And don't forget MCOR.
And MCOR, yeah. Well, MCOR, but I don't know what our MCOR is. I don't have those recorded on my phone like I do for others.
Right.
I mean, I mean, I'd like to hear some other people comment. I mean, everybody else on this call has been trained as a strengths and APEST coach. So anybody else see that?
I could comment. I remember going to the workshop in Pittsburgh, and one of the techniques that we were taught was to have people give an example of how they felt like that strength was working in their life. So I can just see this as a broadening of that, focusing on a little bit different way of getting at it, but also, it's the same thing. It does bring out then how people can actually see that strength at work. Yeah.
So. Okay, awesome. And the connections between those strengths as well, I think, is really important.
So Josh, I did On Fire, which you may not be familiar with, but we did the strength, the APEST and the MCOR.
Yes.
And the MCOR really wasn't helpful to me until I was coached with all three, like pulling them together.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that coaching element is really important with the MCOR piece.
Yeah, it is critical because it gets at an underlying piece beneath the strengths. So, for example, with Elizabeth, do you mind me sharing some of your core motivations? Right. So she's got relator, individualization, maximizer, responsibility, deliberateness as strengths. But part of what's underlying that is this deep desire to collaboratively make an impact. And so a person can be a relator for all kinds of reasons, or they can want to maximize for all kinds of reasons. But notice in her story that the whole thing is ordered towards shaping them around giving God glory and cultivating collaboration. So those strengths are oriented by a certain core motivation, but I think you're right, Sue, that the coaching helps to draw that out. Sometimes it's not as obvious what the underlying motivations are, but they orient the strengths and the relational style, the ministry style of APEST.
So I am taking on, I think I'm biting off more than I can chew with, I'm the Alpha coordinator at our parish, and I bought 90 StrengthsFinders. And I have a paper APEST test that's not exactly like the one that you do online. And I was going to bring in a presenter, have people take both of those, and then kind of just present how the two relate, and kind of like a 2-hour seminar. Because we have probably about 60 people who have been table hosts and helpers. And I was even going to include our meal team because they're so dedicated to Alpha. Mm-hmm. But we just will not have enough coaches to probably individually sit down with them. So that's kind of scaring me a little bit, that you kind of have them take this, but how much further can they go if they're not going to be coached?
Yeah, that is a logistical challenge. I will say this, that one of the ways to hasten, as Pat used the word warp speed, in terms of understanding Elizabeth's strengths and their integration, but in a group context, one of the ways that you can hasten self and other understanding is by doing an achievement storytelling exercise. And then having them talk about one or two of their strengths that most resonate, because they can contextualize them right away and illustrate them right away.
Okay, that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Sue, I can help you with that offline. I'll call you. But there's a way that you can actually arrange these people in triads, and you have a coach, a coachee, and an observer. And there is actually a process for that. And I think we'll talk about that. But it can be done in large groups. It's suboptimal, but it's better than doing nothing with all those assessments.
Okay, that'd be great.
Good. Well, nice, robust conversation. It's great. I want to just close things from my own presentation standpoint by looking at some of the manifold value of this achievement story interview. The very fact of helping people to talk about their achievement stories will often give them clarity about their pattern of giftedness. Right? So their core motivations, their strengths, their relational style, and again, these are part of one pattern. They're part of one unified pattern. So speaking about the stories helps to give insight, obviously both for the person and for you. It also shows integration, and we saw that with Elizabeth's strengths, and hopefully as we start also to connect those with the underlying core motivation and her APEST, her prophetic piece as well. It's a positive and joyful experience, right? It's just a beautiful experience in and of itself. You can quickly build rapport with clients. You can also help them build rapport with one another. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to do team building with a new ministry team, and in this busy, complex, frenetic culture we live in, we sometimes are not very intentional about building relationships. A shared achievement story activity is one way to really cultivate some quick relationship building. Those are a few of the values of this process. Let me stop now and ask if there's any questions or comments here before we move towards closure.
Josh, I think this is super helpful. And what we've learned, we've got a couple of the strengths coaches who you coach with MCOR that have really baked the achievement stories into their strengths process. Mm-hmm. And the feedback I'm getting is just phenomenal. That when you really are much more intentional about having these coachees come up with achievement stories, it really does accelerate the ability to go deeper with your coaches around their strengths.
Yeah.
One other thing too I want to mention that Sue touched on, and Sue, you nailed it. I mean, what we have found in a lot of the work that we do with leaders, clergy, priests, is integrating all three of these tools. Strengths is how we do it, MCOR is why we do it, and the APEST tool is what we do and where we do them in terms of ministry styles. So I just really want to affirm, Josh, your catalytic behavior of encouraging us to move more into achievement stories as we train coaches. So thanks for that.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad to be of help. One quick story. I work at Franciscan University and help with the Catechetical Institute. So I did a whole workshop on asking good questions as coaches. And there's a guy who's doing some family mission work in Ireland. And part of the workshop is to, take a person through an achievement story interview process, like I'm asking you all to do with your three people. So he's working with this young lady in Ireland who's a musician, but she felt for some reason that she needed to set that aside and not focus upon her music. But her achievement story was all about her music. And it was so catalytic for her, to use your word, Pat, that she recognized as she was sharing the story how much she loves worship music and taking people into worship through music. So she decided after the time of coaching around story that she's going to go back into music. And what I'm told by this wonderful, wonderful fellow, Patrick, is that she just recently cut a CD and was leading worship for about 4,000 people in Ireland. And this is a very rare situation, but it is a dramatic example of where when you attend to people and affirm those deep moments of action that's really life-giving and God-given, that it can help them become more of who they are. And that's a kind of dramatic example, but it's a true example. And there's a lot of power in this process. All right. Well, this is recorded. I'll send it out to the Human Formation Coalition so you can send it along or access it again. And of course, you've got the PowerPoint available as well. Anything else?
We have a few coaches trainings coming up with the Human Formation Coalition. You are actually doing one, Josh, starting in May, at the end of May for 6 weeks. It's really talking about all this. So if you guys are interested, please don't hesitate to look up more information on that, or send more people our way that might want to join. It's a great training. I've gone through it myself, and it's just beneficial as you're using all these tools, truly, to help people understand who God has made them to be. So if you can bring anyone our way, we'd really appreciate it. We've got some other APEST and StrengthsFinders coachings coming up in June and July, and one for seminary context as well in the summer. And our next webinar is May 22nd with Monsignor Gaston from Mother of Sorrows in the Diocese of Greensburg. And he's really going to be talking about personal vocation and giving us a vision for discipleship in the parish context. So please spread the word. If you have any idea on how we can get more people on here, or you have any thoughts that you want to share, please just email Sharon Bogus and let us know how we can do things better. Thank you so much, Josh, for all you did today.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you all for participating. Thank you.
God
Bye-bye.
bless.
You too.